All right, you guys, let's get into this. This is the April 8th total solar eclipse happening in Aries, like I said, on April 8th this year. So this is the last time for like 20 years we'll have a total eclipse visible from somewhere in the United States, continental United States anyway. So I'm going to take this pretty slowly because there's a lot going on. And you're going to be hearing a lot about this. I'm actually going to release this video earlier than I normally would so that we can get ahead of any kind of fear mongering or anything like that that you might see on social media. You can feel confident and grounded in the information with visuals to make it all make sense of everything that's going on. If you follow the Modern School of Ancient Wisdom free Patreon tier, you've already seen a write-up of this, which may be something that aligns with your learning style a little bit more. You can have both. Take this video, use it, and let feel grounded in the information. And also go ahead and subscribe to the free tier of Modern School of Ancient Wisdom Patreon, where there is a really detailed description of the timing of this eclipse and everything that's going on. All of that information will make its way into here as well, but it's a little bit of a quicker, easier reference if you wanted to have a written form. So we are going to jump into the chart for the Aries eclipse. You may have heard that this is an intense eclipse. And what I want to do is make sure that I am neither fear-mongering nor sugarcoating what this eclipse signifies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote ancient sources a lot. And then I'm going to try to say, this is what the source says, here's how it might show up for us, given everything else that we know of what is actually showing up. We're not just going to say, here's what the ancients say, so war. We're going to say, here's what the ancients say. And in the context of what we know in our rational world, here is something that seems really reasonable that could arise. Knowing that surprises do happen, there is actual transit that is coming up where surprises are expected to happen. It involves Uranus. So the astrology of this eclipse is fascinating and compounding and incredible. The significations of this eclipse are definitely something that you can guard your emotions with, and that you can know we are dealing with this as a solar eclipse on a societal scale, on a global scale. So the effects of this are something we're going to see as a world and experience together, particularly when it comes to things that happen around our leadership structures or around the people who are considered wealthy or famous structures. So those are the influences we're going to see. And then we as the people are going to be able to respond to the changes that come to our society as a result of those things. And this is something that unfolds over time. I also really want to emphasize that the solar eclipse, for the duration of the eclipse, which is more than 3 hours, that signifies 1 year for each hour of the eclipse. So this is a thing that's going to unfold over 3 years. And if Ptolemy is to be agreed upon or is to be relied upon, we are going to see this actually not even starting this year. We'll probably see something that kind of highlights the, hey, this is coming around the eclipse so that we know the flavor of what's on the horizon, but it's not even going to start this year. So we have plenty of time. It's not going to all fall on us at once. There will be time to roll with whatever punches come our way. So with that foundation in effect already, with that understanding, knowing that the world has gone through its phases, its peaks and troughs, and we are now in a time where some of the energy may be a bit peaked, we want to just take that in the most rational sense, knowing that we are the stewards of our own energy, we are the choosers of our own decisions, and that whatever comes our way, we will be equipped to handle it in the best way that we will be able to. And I have that full confidence for everybody here, because it's a eclipse. So we want to take that seriously, but we also want to say that just as much as Mars creates conflict, Mars empowers. So what I want for you as an individual is the empowerment that Mars can offer. So here we go. I'm going to show you this chart. We're going to up on Luna. Here we go. All right, so this is the chart for the eclipse. It is located at this point in the wrong place. I'm going to put it for Washington, D.C. The reason I'm going to do that is so that we have a representative location of our nation, the United States. It is our capital, so we kind of use that to embodiment of the country. Now, if you are someone who wants to get even more detailed with this, you would cast this eclipse chart for April 8th, whatever time the eclipse is perfecting. So you want to make sure your chart has the sun and the moon both at 19 degrees and 24 minutes. You would cast that chart for the location of the capital of your state, because by ancient standards, where they were looking at kingdoms and smaller nations, the United States, as this grouping of sovereign states that we have, we would be considered an empire. That is something that is a bit larger. The United States is such a massive landmass. There's so much to cover. There are cultural differences throughout the nation. So different things may happen in different areas, especially considering that this eclipse is more visible and more total in certain areas than others. For example, Washington, D.C. is going to see only about 80 to 86% of the totality of the eclipse. It is not in that path of 100% totality. Therefore, that decreases a little bit the intensity of the significations of the eclipse. And we will go into that. The more visible the eclipse, the more its effects are pertinent and relevant to that location. That is one of the first rules that a lot of astrologers of ancient times and even now seem to agree upon. So diving into this, let's keep it basic to start, right? This is, in essence, a new moon. This is a new moon happening in Aries, and the sun is exalted at the 19th degree of Aries, which, believe it or not, because the houses start from 0 to 30, would actually be 18-degree Aries. So when the sun was at 18-degree Aries, it was at its point of most exaltation in its sign of exaltation. Now what we are seeing is it is a degree after that, because the 19th degree, if we're starting at 0, is actually the 20th. So I know we should just like fix the numbering there, but that's the way it's done. So it starts at 0 and it goes to 30. And so knowing that 18-degree Aries is the 19th degree of the sign, which is the sun's point of exaltation, now we are at the 20th degree of Aries, heading towards, we're about 20.5 degrees into Aries here. And so that gives us something to work with as well. So it's past the sun's exaltation, but still quite near it. Like, this is the region of the sky where the sun's really experiencing that exaltation. And we have this new moon. And because the new moon is happening at the same declination as the sun, that is what allows for the eclipse to happen. So imagine, and I'm going to try to do this with the way that it actually works. You are the Earth. This is the sun because it's bigger. This is the moon because it's smaller. We have this unique ability in our planet and with the way things are set up for the sun to be as far away from Earth as it is and the moon to be as close to Earth as it is. And this actually kind of works where when they are at the same declination, the moon can completely block out the sun, as compared to sometimes when the moon is like this. So we still get to see the sun, but we don't see the moon because the rays of the sun block out the moon at night, and because the moon is next to the sun during the day, which means it's not in our night sky. That's a typical new moon. An eclipse is when the declination is just right, that it blocks out the sun entirely. And that's only possible because of the apparent magnitude, which is that the sun and the moon, due to their distances from Earth, actually look like they're the same size. So now you got to have a bit of a kind of astronomy lesson to go with that. And I'm glad that the visual effects worked out so well too. That makes me pretty happy. So we are seeing this eclipse, and there's some things you're probably already noticing. Work with me, work at my pace here, and I promise you I will probably point out the things that you are noticing. If I don't, you can comment on this video and I will address them if they are something that you would like to hear more about. So what we are looking at primarily is the sun, which is receiving this eclipse. The sun exalted near the north node, which is how we know it's an eclipse, because if it's in roughly 15 degrees from the north node, we know we're going to have an eclipse. If it were outside of that region, it would still be in Aries, but not eclipsed, because that would not be the appropriate declination. So first thing we notice is this is a new moon eclipse in Aries. Now, the first thing we think about is, what does Aries talk about? What is Aries topics think of? Now, Aries is cardinal. Aries is a fire sign, and Aries has a lot of young, masculine, or driven energy. So we're thinking about new things starting, a lot of fire, a lot of ambition, a lot of creativity that goes with this. So typically this would be the exalted sun, new moon here, a beginning of a cycle that brings a lot of creative energy. If we think about, and I really like to do this, we think about Pisces as the primordial ooze. Aries is the life that springs forth from that. So that's one thing we can think of, because this is in the Northern Hemisphere, our vernal sign. It is an equinoctial sign, which is the sign where an equinox takes place. And we do know that we just experienced, when the sun came into Aries, roughly 19 days ago at this point, we are experiencing that equinox point of the year. We have a new zodiacal year that has just begun, and right away we get an eclipse in it, which is not common. It's not something that happens every time a new year begins. It is happening right now with the way that the cycle is occurring with the eclipse cycle. So that's something to keep in mind as well. This is not happening every year. This is something that's happening this year. It's a little bit unique. And it's something that's really bringing sparks of initiation to our process. Big ones, because it is an eclipse, right? So now we're going to get into some things that are going on at the same time. Co-present with this eclipse, we have Venus now in Aries, not her favorite place to be. Venus kind of in this chart now saying that divine feminine and relationships and the way that we value things is also a little bit Aryan, a little bit counterculture. Maybe it's not as docile, maybe it's more ambitious, maybe it's more pointed. And so we're seeing that as well. Venus as a representation of the female population, or at least female presenting population or expressing population, shows that it is a little bit on the slimmer side of their resources at this point. They are from their creativity as well, maybe particularly to be resourceful. And we also see that we have Mercury retrograde, who, even though it's over the line here, it's because so many people, so many planets have balled up in this area. Mercury retrograde is also present in Aries. So we're looking at, again, communication or technology or connections being a little bit off the mark right now. So there might be a lot of relationships where things are getting a little bit heated and people are saying things faster than they're thinking about them, and they're coming out not in the way that they would have said if they would have given it a beat before speaking. So that's stuff happening at the same time in the same sign. Next, I want to move on really quickly to the fact that it is happening in the ninth house of the chart. This is the ninth house, where we see it is the house of God in ancient astrology. But what it amounts to is politics, religion, fairs, foreign travel, those kinds of things. So it's very much higher education also falls here. So it's the things that happen abroad, or the things that broaden our minds and our experience, typically happen here. In mundane astrology, we might be looking at foreign relations, things having to do, which comes up again later, things have to do with sacred rights, things having to do with politics and religion, which in the US right now is not surprising, right? So it's something that we're like, ooh, those are the topics we don't talk about at the table, but they are topics that we are talking about everywhere else right now. So something to just keep in mind and keep ourselves grounded in. Now, next thing we're going to talk about is the duration of the eclipse, which I mentioned before. This eclipse, according to space.com, lasts 3 hours and 16 minutes. Now, according to Ptolemy, for every hour that the eclipse lasts, a solar eclipse will have its significations for a year equal to that. So 3 hours and 16 minutes, when you break that down with math, comes to about 3 years and about 3.5 months. Now, we don't stop there. We actually go a little bit more detailed than this, because the eclipse significations do not necessarily begin on the same day as the eclipse. And in fact, in this case, they do not. So if the eclipse were happening at the horizon, everything would be happening right away. It would be the rising eclipse and everything would just fire off at the same time. And so it would be starting on April 8th, 3 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks of significations starting from then. But this eclipse is happening up in the middle third of the northern hemisphere of this chart, or a visible hemisphere of this chart. So what we are experiencing here, if we listen to Ptolemy, when we see something happening in this particular section, in that middle section of that top hemisphere of the chart, this is what shows us that this 3 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks actually begins more into the period of time. So it's going to start second quarter of that period of time, and then it's going to intensify in the second third of that period of time. So what we see here is that the significations of this are going to happen somewhere around maybe April of 2026, and the intensifications will happen somewhere around May or June of 2027. Now, this is a lot of math, I know, and I did have people check it with me, but if you get different math, let me know, because we will just test both, right? If you get different math, study it, because we are people making these calculations. The sky is doing what it's doing, and it's probably not as intense about the mathing of it out as we are. But anyway, we're looking at this as something that's going to start around April, and that 3-year timer then starts around April of 2026. And then the most intense part of that will happen around the May-June period of 2027, according to this calculation. Other astrologers do have other calculations, but I've been using Ptolemy, and it's been something that I've been studying. It seems to be playing out pretty well, but I'm really looking forward to doing more research with it. So this is one of those cases that I will be using as a case study. Now, getting into this, that is what we're seeing about when this is going to take place. When do we think all of this stuff is going to come to pass? Now we have the when. Okay, so if we are looking at this beginning in that April 2026 timeframe, we are also now conscious of the ruler of this eclipse. Aries is ruled by Mars. Mars is over here. You can notice Mars is applying to a conjunction with Saturn. This is actually tracked in ancient times, very much like we track the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which you might have heard of as the Great Conjunction, because it is something that happened back in 2020 on December 21st. A lot of people were talking about it as sort of like the Bethlehem or Christmas star. It is a big cycle that begins new in society every 20 years. Similarly, we have the cycle of Mars and Saturn, which is called the middle conjunction that we are looking at here. And according to Mashallah, that middle conjunction is something that brings about very Saturn-Mars significations. These are both the malefics. However, you are meant to look at the ruler of the sign where this takes place to see if it is something that Mashallah says is productive and fit, or if it is something that is unfit and more destructive. Fortunately, what we have here is it's taking place in Pisces. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, the great benefic. So hopefully this cycle of this middle conjunction will be something that brings about changes and actions, potentially conflicts as well, as Mars is always straight up just attributed to war right away in ancient astrology. So we are going to be seeing a lot of change, a lot of conflict that hopefully leads to fit or productive change. So even though it may not be the comfortable kind of change, it should be the kind of change according to this ideology that leads to something better on the other side. So it's something hopefully worth fighting for that leads to something better for the world as a whole. Ironically, that should last the entire cycle between this Mars and Saturn conjunction and the next one. The next one happens at what might sound familiar around April 2026. So for the cycle of this Mars-Saturn conjunction cycle, this middle conjunction cycle, we are also getting ready for the significations of this eclipse that will bring us around to that as well. And then the next time that these two meet, it will also be in Aries. So that is something to keep in mind as we look way ahead. Let's pull it back a little bit and then talk a little bit more about the difference of what's going on and who is affected or what is affected by an eclipse in Aries. Now, if we go to Ptolemy, Ptolemy talks about the sign of Aries affecting four-footed animals, new shoots and arboreal crops, sacred rites, and the worship of gods. That is because it is an equinoctial sign, like we mentioned before. With this eclipse happening near the midheaven is right over here, and it is falling away from the midheaven, but it is in that same area of the chart. So with it happening near the midheaven, we see that according to Ptolemy, those near the midheaven above the earth concerning sacred rites, kings, and people of middle age. So you can see again that sacred rites thing popping up. Kings has a double signification here because kings are also represented by the sun. So the solar eclipse given is that it is going to be something that affects leadership or those in positions of wealth and power. So we're seeing again that the place of the eclipse, as well as the luminary that is involved in the eclipse, are both saying, hey, leadership is going through some change here. Leadership is the one receiving what is going on with this. So again, watching our elected officials, watching our leaders, watching our managers, and watching our celebrities or people of wealth, they are the ones who will be showing us most drastically or most clearly what the significance of this eclipse is going to be. Now, next thing we see is Mars, the ruler of the eclipse, positioned according to the eclipse. So Mars is oriental or is in the day according to the eclipse. So we see that of that class that has been signified, that middle-aged kings, people of sacred rights, and wealthy, a majority of them are going to be experiencing this. So we are going to see potentially some shifts for people in those positions. And then we can talk a little bit more about the ruler. And according to Ptolemy, we're going to jump back into Mars being the ruler. Yes, Mars is conjunct Saturn. That is something to take into account. So Ptolemy says that Mars, when he assumes the rulership alone, is in general the cause of destruction through dryness, and in particular, when the event concerns men, brings about wars, civil faction, capture, enslavement, uprisings, the wrath of leaders, and sudden deaths arising from such causes. And all of these things that are associated with Mars, right? And again, we have experienced 18 years ago, we experienced eclipses in Aries as well. Even 9 years ago, we experienced eclipses in Aries. Even a year ago, we experienced eclipses in Aries. So I want to reemphasize that even though this brings about some pretty hot words, as Mars does, know that this is Mars archetype. This is Mars just giving you like a bunch of keywords and then seeing where those actionable things might actually be showing up. It may not be as literal as it appears here, and it still may be. I can't really make that call until we see what comes forth. That's not really my position. What I'm here to do is share with you what Ptolemy is saying about this and what many astrologers agree. Mars has a very cutting kind of energy. Mars is very pointed and penetrative. So we see these Mars archetypes coming forward in this. Now, Saturn is there. Saturn may impose some boundaries on that or restrictions on that. There may be some authority that Mars has to yield to as Mars is applying to Saturn. So we'll see how that shows up. And again, this is going to be occurring over years. This is something that is going to be fitting in line with what we're already experiencing. This is part of a greater cycle. So I don't think we'll necessarily be blindsided too much by what comes in. I don't want you to be afraid. The worst thing that we can do is have anxiety about something that hasn't even happened. When things occur, we find out how we can respond to them. We find out how we can react and do the best that we can do in that moment. Looking ahead, one of the drawbacks of astrology is the looking ahead. And for people who aren't really into it yet and haven't gotten into that, it's kind of like when a doctor takes every life into their hands and feels they are responsible for the quality of that life inside and outside of their exam room. When we are looking at astrology, we are looking at the potentials of what may happen, and then we become a human outside of that. You go back to being a human after looking at the chart, and you interact with the world, knowing that the world's condition is not your responsibility, but the awareness of it may be something that you can use to help later. So that is something that, whether it's something really great or whether it's something really challenging, that's how you can take this energy and alchemize it into something very useful as a human being outside of your astrological practice or awareness. So I want to keep that in mind as well. So we are seeing, especially with Mars being in Pisces, there is a section about things at sea. So it might be interesting to take advantage of that signification and note that Ptolemy also talks about if Mars, is talking about something at sea, we see the significations of shipwrecks or failure of waters, of rivers, of drying up of springs, tainting of potable waters, and reference to necessities produced upon the earth for human use causes a scarcity and a loss of dumb animals and of things which grow from the earth, a loss of crops by dying as a result of hot weather or by locusts or by the beating of winds or by burning in places of storage. So how might this show up, right? We're thinking about where might we experience some shortages and why might that be? Maybe some areas that were more conducive to farming become a little bit dry because of certain changes that are going on in our environment, and we have to adapt to that. Just because the change happens doesn't mean we can't adapt to it, doesn't mean we can't react to it, and doesn't mean we can't remedy it. The life goes in circles, so we will see that we're in a peak or a trough. And when we have our lows, it gives us something that we can work on to develop something new so that we can continue to adapt. So these might be things that we are adapting to in the coming years, which again, for many of us and the awareness that we have with our current climate, that is something that we are kind of already aware of to a certain degree. So now we have the opportunity to be active as possible, at least in our individual lives. So other things that are going on at this time that are really interesting. Again, we already talked about this conjunction, the middle conjunction here, but Venus is doing something really interesting here as well. Venus is at her morning set. She is now going to be gaining on the sun. So she is going to be getting closer and closer to the sun, as she has been for a little while. And so now we're going to lose sight of her. Where normally in the mornings right now, she would be that bright star on the horizon before the sun comes up. She is going to get so close to the sun that she will not be visible anymore. And this because Venus was the ruler of the eclipse, the solar eclipse last October. And we know what happened last October and some of the things that occurred then. She actually signals, according to Ptolemy, an abatement of those things. So I've been following Venus in accordance with a lot of events that happened last October. And so if this works, Venus is signifying that those events are going to have an abatement. They're going to settle down. They're going to tone down towards something more calm rather than being active. So that's something to look forward to as well. In addition to that, we also have, I'm telling you, there's so much going on with this one. We also have something that will not show up on the chart, and it is a comet that some of you may have heard of. It is known as the Devil Comet, mostly because it is a comet that is volcanic and has two volcanoes that are spewing on either side, kind of where a devil's horns would be. I like to think about the devil emoji a little more than like a devil comet that's signaling that we're all going to die. That's not the case. What we're seeing here is this comet that is a comet, which is something that Ptolemy would say to look for. You know, what kind of color does it have? Where is it occurring? It is occurring in the tropical sign of Aries. And really, what we're going to see is because of where it's showing up, it's going to be visible towards this Jupiter-Uranus situation. So it's happening in the tropical sign of Aries, but you're going to see it in the sky. If you wanted to find it, you wouldn't look at the sun and look over, you would look for where Jupiter would be. So in the evening or even during the eclipse, because the sun will be occluded, if you were in the path of totality, the sky will go dark and you should be able to see this comet at the same time, even though right now it's better to use binoculars or a telescope because of how faint it is, because of how close to the sun it is getting. Because the sun will go out, we will be able to see it. So the idea is that we can now see a comet at the same time as an eclipse. And according to Ptolemy, comets, which appear either at the time of the eclipse or at any time, whatever, for instance, the so-called beams, trumpets, jars, and the like, for these naturally produce effects peculiar to Mars and to Mercury, which include wars, hot weather, disturbed conditions, and the accompaniments of these. And they show through the parts of the zodiac in which their heads appear, Aries in this case, the directions in which the shapes of their tails point, and it's going to be pointing, I believe, towards Taurus, the regions upon which these misfortunes impend. Now, in the ancient times, each zodiacal sign was given to a nation according to the bands of longitude and latitude. At those times, the United States and all of North America and South America were not considered. So it's hard for us to say which klima is to be affected by this for the area that the eclipse is actually visible. So this one's a bit hard for us to calculate. So we just know that because it's visible to North America, a lot of North America may be the one receiving some of this signification, and that comets are kind of activating. So we're going to see them doing something of the nature of Mars and Mercury, which is unexpected, quite mercurial, and to bring something perhaps sudden that goes along with it. Now, for the timing of the comet, that is not applied to the timing of the eclipse. So for the comet, that may be something that happens more impending or more immediately than the significations of the eclipse, which are anticipated for next year. So that's something we have to keep in mind as well. This eclipse energy is going to feel quite prolonged because we also have that Mercury retrograde in Aries. So we're seeing this like wonky feeling of feeling thrown off, and our energy's all kind of out of whack because the luminaries have been taking turns being off. But also, we have this eclipse, and then we have this comet bringing more intensity to it, or maybe perhaps some more overwhelm. And then even after the eclipse, Mercury remains in retrograde, and we can check this here in Luna. Mercury remains in retrograde through most of April until the 25th. So through April 25th, if you're like, man, I still haven't recovered from that eclipse energetically or in my own vitality, it may be that you're actually still feeling Mercury retrograde. So I just want to kind of give you this is what's going on, so that if you're feeling it, it is sort of drawn out by the fact that Mercury is there highlighting the scene. And I think with that, I have covered everything. So really quickly, I'm going to go back and I'm going to summarize. This is an eclipse, a total solar eclipse happening in Aries at the 19th degree, which is 1 degree past the sun's point of exaltation. It is an eclipse happening on April 8th at, if you're in Washington, D.C. or in the East Coast, around 2:20 is going to be that peak time where they are exactly conjunct. Check your current listings or check your local listings for exactly the time to be able to witness it if you are in a path of totality, because the chart's not going to be exactly the same as what you're witnessing. Just because they are exactly conjunct at that time doesn't mean from your angle on Earth that that's going to be, the perfect time to witness it. I don't want you to miss it just because you're using a chart time. It's very important that you get to see the totality if you have that ability. Make sure you're wearing your safe glasses and that your cameras also have lens covers. You can get those online as well. I did for my phone. I know my mom got one for her telescope. It's definitely something you want to protect anything that acts like an eye at this time. So one last thing I want to point out is I had mentioned very briefly about the Jupiter-Uranus. This is going to come to fruition or to its exact conjunction on the 20th. So that is where we're looking at a lot of surprise coming in. Now, this is going to be surprise of a Taurian nature, which is something to do with our resources, something to do with our the systems and structures that we rely on for livelihood, which have been receiving upgrades and changes since 2017, 2018, when Uranus came into Taurus. Jupiter is saying, hey, let's make this big, let's get loud, let's make it noticeable. All of those themes are going to be something that kind of gets an air horn on that day. Again, not necessarily something that is totally unexpected, but a very poignant plot point of Uranus and Taurus. So we have this eclipse happening in Aries, which is giving us a lot of Aryan, fiery, martial kind of energy to it, that is going to be likely taking place over the course of 3 years. 3 years, what was it? 3 months and 2 weeks. And in that time, we actually anticipate the beginning of this top section to be somewhere around April 2026, with the increase happening somewhere around May or June 2027, while also keeping an eye on what Mars does. Because as Mars goes through exactly what we talked about with Venus, risings, settings, retrogrades, and Mars is going to retrograde later this year in November through next February, we are also going to see points of this eclipse coming up because Mars rules it. And so Mars is carrying that eclipse with it. And that is giving us the opportunity to say, hey, this may be something that's part of the eclipse story as well. So it's important to also think about October 2025 when Mars does have that morning set. October 2025, Mars will have that set, and we will probably notice, which would be an abatement, certain significations. But again, it's something to keep an eye on to say what key significations are going on here before we see the April 2026 beginning of these events. Coinciding with this, we have the Mars and Saturn middle conjunction, which is starting a new cycle that will lead us through 2026 again. Coinciding, not they are mutually exclusive, so they are not always tied together, but in this case, they're happening at the same time, where the next time that we see that April 2026 beginning of this timing will be the next Mars and Saturn conjunction as well. So this seems like an intense eclipse going on. It is not the only thing going on in astrology. It is not the only thing going on in the world. There's a lot happening. We are going through a period of change, of reawakening, of revolutionizing our structures structures in our systems and coming to new ideas. And I want to emphasize that on a personal level, Aries and Mars can be just as defensive, protective, and creative as anything else. So, in your personal life, I do recommend as an affirmation for this eclipse, if you are saying, well, what am I supposed to do with this? The affirmation I would recommend is just reiterating that I am ready to take my place, whatever that is. And you can do a card pull for what you are currently creating in your life and for what you are healing to make space for that thing that you are currently creating in your life. And hopefully these will help you. I hope with all of the information that has gone into this, that it has been helpful, valuable, rational, and grounding, and that you have an incredible experience witnessing this eclipse, no matter what, because it is going to be quite the spectacle. I can't wait. I've got my eclipse glasses ready. I'm going to be chasing this thing. And I do know that while the world is changing, I have the power to make my own decisions, and I will use them for the greatest good that I can imagine in the capacity that I am able to act. And I know you will as well. And I think that the world is going to act and heal and do wonderful things together through whatever comes our way. So many blessings to all of you. I hope you have an incredible time. Feel free to, if you're on the Patreon, post your pictures of the eclipse if you get really good ones, as long as you are doing it safely. I appreciate all of you, and we'll see you soon.